Starting off a critique isn't always easy. Sometimes you can come up with an angle to tackle something straight away because there's a big talking point you immediately want to sink your teeth into, and since I'm obviously not doing that right now, you can tell that I'm not just struggling with this review but also with the Mass Effect series as a whole. And judging by this video's length, I also have a lot to talk about, so there isn't one singular thing upon which I could hook this review. The truth is that this series has always frustrated me to some extent. I like the setting, the narrative, and the characters a lot, but BioWare never seemed capable of delivering gameplay of comparable quality. Sure, I had my problems even with the aspects of the games that I liked, but I don't want to spend time here to bring up the failings of the Mass Effect trilogy, not when I could use said time to talk about the failings of Mass Effect Andromeda instead, because trust me, Mass Effect Andromeda fails in a lot of places, and I'll get to those eventually, but I don't want to reveal my entire hand all at once. To soften the blow a little, I'll state right here at the start that I don't think Mass Effect Andromeda is an outright terrible game. It has problems, and not too few. Some are small, some are fairly substantial, but nothing in Mass Effect Andromeda truly managed to aggravate me to the point where I thought it wasn't worth playing at all. Because if that were the case, I would have stopped playing it altogether at that point and just told you about that. I'm not the type of person to seek out and endure entertainment I despise, and I don't think I would need to play through an entire game that I find terrible just to make sure that it's terrible from beginning to end in order to justify a negative opinion. Looking back at my playtimes with the Mass Effect trilogy, the cumulative number of hours I've spent with those 3 games is at around 90 hours. That seems awfully short in retrospect, considering that any given RPG on its own can typically easily last that long, but according to the average playtimes courtesy of howlongtobeat.com, it's a fairly common amount of time to spend with all these games if you don't go for an absolute completionist run. Conversely, I spent around 73 hours with Mass Effect Andromeda alone. At the very least, it must have done something right for me to spend almost the same amount of time with it as with the previous 3 games combined. But enough beating around the bush, let's go into some specifics. Also, be warned that in order to properly discuss this game, I will need to spoil a lot of it. You have been warned. Chapter 1: Messing with the set dressing. The Mass Effect series has made some pretty big splashes in the past when it came to narrative. More specifically, it managed to alienate a lot of very vocal people with an ending that, to put it charitably, left a lot to be desired. And I freely admit that I too had a lot of gripes with the original ending, and I felt that the revised ending was a weak attempt at backpedaling to appease fans. It certainly tainted my overall opinion of the series, but not to the extent at which I would issue death threats to members of the development team like some of the less level-headed people who unfortunately happen to share this particular hobby of mine. And let me just use this opportunity to get on my soapbox for a second and say that if you think this is acceptable behavior, then please vacate this planet on a permanent basis. Harassing people over a video game, or any other type of entertainment for that matter, is unacceptable and fucking disgraceful, and I feel ashamed to share a hobby with the likes of you. But enough about that. Either version of Mass Effect 3's ending pretty decisively resolved that story's particular conflict, and following up that ending seemed like it would only needlessly dwell on the wounds. So it makes sense that Mass Effect Andromeda uses the central conflict of the original trilogy as a jumping off point for a brand new, unrelated adventure in a different galaxy, since the canonical impending invasion of the Reapers seems like such an inevitability that a portion of the Milky Way population decided to leave their home for good. They pack 5 big-ass ships, which are obviously called arcs because what else would you call them, and another Citadel-inspired space station called the Nexus with 100,000 colonists, give themselves the fancy title of Andromeda Initiative and leave for greener pastures, meaning a handful of worlds that could be determined to have the ability to sustain life on them. There's a lot of hand-wavy technobabble there to assure us that the people in the Milky Way had a reasonable way to assess the habitability of these planets. Because truthfully, since the Andromeda galaxy is around 2.5 million light-years away, that means that the most recent light and thus the most recent information to reach us from that galaxy that we could interpret and study is 2.5 million years old. So not exactly recent history. I mean, 2.5 million years ago, the Homo sapiens, meaning we as a species, didn't even exist. That's just about the time when the last ice age started and the Homo erectus first appeared, and in the span between then and a couple of 100,000 years ago went extinct. All of our recorded history happened in only a fraction of that time frame, so any information we could realistically gather from the Andromeda galaxy would be so woefully out of date that determining the viability of that planet, which can't even be detected from the Milky Way by the way, would be of absolutely no use to us nowadays. Thankfully, science fiction gives us the quasi-magical ability of ignoring these hard limits on intergalactic exploration and also dramatically shortens travel time. Meaning that the FTL trip from the Milky Way to the Andromeda galaxy took our brave pioneers only around 600 years, and the cryostasis means that nobody has to age a second in the meantime. Still, ignoring all these scientific inaccuracies, it's still a decent enough way of kicking off a new story, and I like the idea of being a pioneer and exploring a new frontier. Or I would like to do that. Chapter 2: Rediscovery and Recycling. Mass Effect Andromeda basically pulls the same trick the original trilogy did. It gives us a mysterious ancient race of aliens that disappeared for some reason but left artifacts that somehow still work perfectly after centuries. Those artifacts' inner workings can easily be decoded and operated by a bunch of races from a completely different galaxy with absolutely no prior knowledge or understanding of said ancient race and their technology in a matter of what, a couple of months or years at the very most? I mean, I can understand a desire to populate Andromeda with some alien races for us to encounter and deal with, but we already had the Prothean and Leviathan in the original trilogy, whose sudden disappearance and highly advanced technology were a central focus of the narrative. To basically repeat those beats here once again smacks of some creative bankruptcy. But it doesn't just end there. I mean, there wouldn't be much of a point to this game if you could just show up in a new galaxy and things were hunky-dory. The first thing that happens is that all of the arcs in the Nexus, the space station that's intended as a central hub, have to deal with a phenomenon called the Scourge. It's never really made clear what the Scourge actually is, and even the modest attempts at giving us an explanation that somehow ties it back to that ancient alien race are fairly rudimentary. But a dark energy cloud in outer space doesn't provide us with any enemies we can point a gun at and shoot. So once again we have another alien race called the Ket who complicate matters with their shenanigans. And BioWare once again give exactly the same reason for the Ket's behavior that they already gave for the Reapers and the Collectors. They're doing whatever it is they're doing for a reason we couldn't possibly understand. I've always hated this kind of explanation for multiple reasons. For one, don't try and bullshit me. You came up with this story, BioWare. Don't attempt to make it appear as if you're clever enough to come up with something I couldn't understand. 9 times out of 10 when an author comes up with something like this, you're either in for a hackneyed, nonsensical twist or a deus ex machina. Besides, the actual reason why the Reapers had this cycle of eradicating all life in the galaxy every couple of thousand years was fairly simple to understand. It's because their big central AI that resides inside the Citadel the entire time, right under the noses of all those races the Reapers want to, reap, got it into its head that since every sentient life form would eventually create an artificial intelligence at some point that would end up destroying their creators, just like the Reaper AI did with its creator race, the Leviathan, the best course of action would be to step in and destroy all these burgeoning races before that could happen. It was so nonsensical and convoluted that it made the entire conflict seem to be utterly pointless, not to mention childishly easy to understand, which is exactly the opposite of what the game claimed at every turn when it came to deciphering what the Reaper's ultimate goal would end up being. And similarly, the Ket claim that they're doing whatever they're doing for reasons that we couldn't possibly comprehend. Though this time the game is content with never actually addressing the reason for their behavior at any point. It's just a transparent way of painting them as unambiguously evil. They're hyper-antagonistic and don't even attempt any formal first contact with anybody from the Andromeda Initiative. They just open fire on literally anything that's different than them. Heck, it takes almost a dozen hours of playtime until you hear them speak at all, and even then, they're ridiculously one-note with their condescending, arrogant behavior. This is especially noteworthy because even though they think they're far above any other race in the galaxy, they seem incapable of interacting with the remnant technology. That stuff that the ancient race left lying around all over the region of Andromeda we get to play in. You'd think they welcome us with open arms or at least try to take advantage of us once the newcomers exhibit the ability to interact with the remnant tech within minutes of encountering it for the first time. But apparently the Ket really only have one mode of operation, and as such it makes them woefully one-dimensional. Because they're not just bloodthirsty warmongers, they're also body snatchers. See, there's also another sapient alien race in the Helios cluster called the Angara. When they encountered the Ket some time ago, they at least had some sort of diplomatic exchange before the Ket revealed their true intentions. Which basically is to kidnap the Angara and any other life form for that matter and force them to go through a process called exaltation. All that basically means is that they turn every other life form they find into Ket through a process that overrides all the genetic data of the original life form and harvests the beneficial genetic data from the assimilated species as a means of adaptation. Apparently this is also the only way the Ket species is able to reproduce for some reason, but the game never delves into why the Ket work the way they do, what led to their species even needing this type of proliferation. And I admit that upon learning that the Ket were former Angara, I was impressed by that turn of events and thought that it might lead to further moral complications between the Initiative and the Angara, since it turns out that you've been slaughtering former Angara by the hundreds up to that point. But no, none of that kind of complexity ever arises out of it, because the game goes to great lengths in assuring you that nothing Angaran remains in the Ket once they're transformed. Overall, I just felt that there was way too little motivation given for the cat's behavior. They constantly proclaim that exaltation, the process by which other species are turned into cat, is a gift. But we never actually get to see any convincing evidence for why the cat believed this to be true. There's little to no interaction between the player and the Archon, the leader of the cat forces in the Helios cluster. Whenever we do get to talk to him, it's mostly to exchange platitudes, never to discuss philosophy. And I think this aspect is something that upon reflection permeates the entire Mass Effect series as a whole and sells it short somewhat. Chapter 3: Action and Interaction. Mass Effect Andromeda is categorized as a role-playing game, and it has character levels and upgrade trees that allow you to customize the way gameplay works. However, the only dimension in which it allows you to customize the interaction with the game is through its combat. For a game that features so much talking, it's shocking to me that it never treats dialogue as gameplay beyond romancing. The only other aspect through which BioWare attempted to make dialogue feel like gameplay got taken out after Mass Effect 3, which is the binary morality system. And make no mistake, I absolutely welcome the removal of the trite binary moral choice system. The only effect that had on the previous games were some bonuses for being an absolute paragon saint or a renegade anti-hero. But what we've ended up with now is dialogue that either serves as mere exposition to move the plot forward or to talk to characters and advance interpersonal relationships. You can't simply talk to enemies and convince them to back down from their plan. You can stand face to face with your enemies, but the game only treats this as another opportunity of reinforcing their antagonism, not as a chance for players to change the course of the narrative. Heck, you can't even just talk to the exiled members of the Andromeda Initiative to come back into the fold. If it's not some random fetch quest you're doing for someone, almost every single mission somehow incorporates combat. And I always felt that this is a massive missed opportunity. BioWare is a studio that takes pride in its writing, and yet they couldn't give us something as exciting as a dialogue boss or alternative playstyles from immersive sims like the recent Deus Ex games or Arcane's Prey and Dishonored games. Heck, BioWare themselves already tried something like this with Tali's loyalty mission in Mass Effect 2, which consisted of some combat but also dialogue that you needed to navigate and whose outcome changed the later parts of the game in some way. Also, I have a wrist-mounted computer with a highly advanced artificial intelligence with me all the time, and there's no hacking in here? I mean, one of the biggest themes of Mass Effect is the relationship between organic and synthetic life, and it's also a large reason why the Andromeda Initiative left the Milky Way in addition to things looking doomed because of the Reapers. There's an entire enemy type with the Remnant that consists of machines, and the only way to interact with them is by shooting them. And the best thing we can do in terms of dealing with Remnant technology is a Sudoku puzzle every now and then to unlock something. The AI is merely treated as another source for exposition whenever it scans something unbeknownst to the player and tells them where to go. And speaking of said Sudoku puzzle, why do I have to scan all the glyphs I can enter beforehand? If I have 4 possible symbols and know 3 of them, why can't I just solve the puzzle? It's just another time waster to drag things out, never mind that it's incredibly easy to program an algorithm to solve Sudoku puzzles. Why can my AI understand, parse, and translate completely new alien languages within minutes through my built-in translator, but I have to solve the Sudoku puzzle myself? And it's not like I hate Sudoku, quite the contrary. I like doing puzzles, but that doesn't mean that their presence or requirement are logically consistent with the rest of the game. But let me back up a little here, because I told a lie, sort of. There is hacking enemies in Mass Effect Andromeda, but it's not used in the way you might think. You have 3 flavors of upgrade trees available to you. One is called Combat, the second is Tech, and the third is Biotics. This might lead you to believe that there are 3 distinct playstyles associated with them, with the Tech tree dealing with hacking and taking enemies out remotely, or that you need differing playstyles to deal with certain enemies. And you'd be very wrong for thinking that. Even though only one of the upgrade trees is called Combat, all the active skills on all 3 upgrade trees exclusively serve combat roles, and everything can be used against every enemy type. In essence, all of these offensive skills are simply buttons you can periodically press to more efficiently take down enemies, while doing the classic third-person shooter song and dance of popping up from behind cover to shoot enemies with 4 flavors of firearms. So hacking, which is called Invasion in the Tech tree, is just a debuff you can cast on enemies to weaken their defenses, and all the upgrades you can unlock for that are to increase the duration or effectiveness of the debuff. And that's basically it for how you can employ all these fancy upgrades in Mass Effect Andromeda. Press a button to which you've assigned 3 out of the 20-odd active powers, and then you can wait for the cooldown timer to run out to use them again. And yeah, you've heard correctly, you can only have 3 active powers at your disposal at any given time. Why even waste all that space in the upgrade tree to give me 5 different ways of hurting enemies through my biotics when I can only ever at the very most use 3 powers at any given time? Oh, but you can create 4 different favorite loadouts comprised of 3 powers each to switch to, which is something that I never did during my entire time playing the game, because what's the point of switching if the overall gameplay stays the same? And it's not like it makes tactical sense to bypass the cooldowns, because every time you switch to a new favorite loadout, it initiates the cooldowns as well. You can also switch classes on the fly, but the attributes of those classes are so minuscule that it's hardly ever worth it, so why even pretend like this is still an RPG? There are some synergies you can use between powers by first using a power that primes your targets, and when you use an additional power it stacks its damage, but you never really need to, because the meat and potatoes of this game is the bare-bones third-person cover-based shooting, and all the variants of combat, tech and biotic powers don't feel distinct enough to be worth swapping in and out of your loadout. Even the consumable items like cryo ammo never saw any use from me because I constantly forgot that I even had them, and again, I never felt that threatened by the combat to the point where I had to come up with alternative strategies. Another aspect of the combat that I haven't even addressed yet are your companions. While you're in a territory that can feature combat, you are constantly accompanied by 2 crew members who have the set of combat, tech and biotic powers of their own. Let's ignore the fact that we're still holding on to this archaic Final Fantasy-esque system that only allows you to take barely half of your actual party into missions, though I do feel that this type of party design needs to go the way of the dodo. You can order around your 2 mates around the battlefield through limited commands just like in the earlier games, but honestly, just as with a lot of the other aspects of the combat system, I almost always forgot to do any of that and left them to their own devices. Their damage output also seems substantially lower than your own, so it's not like you could have them do all the nasty stuff while you kick back and play a support role if you were so inclined. They all have upgradable skills of their own, but they're so limited in scope that by the end of the game I had all of them maxed out and a dozen skill points per character that I couldn't spend on anything anymore. There are no meaningful choices for these characters, so why even waste my time by having me assigning their skill points? As such, I also really didn't care about what kind of synergies I could possibly gain out of taking specific team members with me. As a result, I just took my 2 favorite characters with me at all times to at least get some witty banter out of them. And I really feel that the game can't decide what it really wants to give the player when it comes to combat either. You have a jump jet that allows you to hover in midair and a dash mechanic to quickly move around the battlefield. But at the same time, your character always feels exceptionally squishy and weak, with shields disappearing within seconds after entering combat thanks to cheating enemies that use aimbot to aim to the point where your dash will have you reappear, thus making dashing pointless, and also you have lengthy wait times between regenerating shields. Both of these things aren't conducive to a dynamic playstyle that favors quick movement across the battlefield and engaging enemies at close range. The most straightforward and safe way to deal with enemies is to hunker down behind a wall with a sniper rifle, shoot off your powers whenever the cooldown runs out, and in between take out enemies through headshots without ever changing position. The only time you really need to get out of cover is when there's only 2 or 3 enemies left and their AI craps itself and forgets that it shouldn't play hide and seek with you. The old video game design adage simply holds true. Given the opportunity, gamers will optimize the fun out of your game. And it would have been fun to zip around the battlefield and fluidly switch between weapons and combat powers, but the game doesn't seem to be built for that kind of combat. The only enemy that forces you to change up this routine is the boss fight. No, not boss fights, plural, because there's only one boss fight that's repeated 5 or 6 times throughout the game. Basically, every planet has what's called an architect, which is this towering 3-legged robot that requires you to attack its legs before focusing on the head, while it pelts you with a variety of attacks that force you to move out of cover, while it also constantly spawns smaller remnant enemies. The first time when this happened, when I encountered it on Eos, the first non-tutorial planet you get to explore, I thought it was kinda cool, but when I saw that I had to do this exact same fight on every other planet as well, I realized that much of this game is just about going through the same motions over and over again. Chapter 4. The Treadmill, or Moving While Standing Still. Going through the motions basically sums up most of the planets you visit. The so-called golden worlds that were determined to be suitable for colonization all follow the same overall design. They were once made habitable by that mysterious ancient race called the Jardan. The Jardan built the remnants technology and places called vaults, which are underground structures that somehow rapidly terraform, for lack of a better word, the planets they're located on. And since the Jardan disappeared when the Scourge happened, all the vaults stopped working properly somehow, which obviously threatens life on said planets. Your task is to activate the vaults, which is done by visiting 3 monoliths to open the entrance and then entering the vault to basically hit Ctrl-Alt-Delete and restart them, which increases viability on said planet by either reducing radiation levels or adjusting temperatures, after which you can plonk down a settlement onto said planet. The planets overall are designed like your typical open world games, with certain locations that are used to progress the story and a whole lot of other stuff that's either there to serve as a point of interest, random combat encounters, to gather resources and do side quests in. And I feel that Mass Effect Andromeda falls in exactly the same pitfalls that many open world games fall into. You can roam around the place as much as you like, but exploration is largely fruitless because the parts you need to visit in order to advance the plotline or even just advance side quests are carefully gated off by some door that you need to open that only unlocks whenever the game feels like giving you access to it. Heck, the maps are literally gated off at the edges where you can see the planets continue for miles on end, but there is a glowing blue barrier that just doesn't want to let you leave. For all intents and purposes, this is a linear narrative and all the side quests you can do have little bearing on how the story advances. Sure, completing quests increases the viability percentage of that world, but the payoff at the very end for bringing the worlds up to 100% is just that the planet where you first crash landed gets named after you. And I don't think you even need to visit all the available golden worlds and restore viability to beat the game, since the quest to go after the Archon doesn't even lead across all of these planets. I feel like these side quests could have been integrated better into the main narrative to actually give you a reason to do them. For example, there's this one quest on the planet called VIII called Uncovering the Past, where you can find an ancient AI that was built by the Angara. The history of the Angara is shrouded in mystery since they have been persecuted by the Ket for so long and also fallen victim to the Scourge a couple of centuries ago before the Ket business started. Many quests deal with uncovering their past until you eventually learn that the Angara were created by the Jordan as well. It's left unclear for what reason, but it certainly paints an evocative picture where the elusive Jordan made the worlds in the Helios cluster viable and habitable through their vaults and the random tech and then populated them with a race of their own creation. Said race eventually created an advanced artificial intelligence before losing most of their history and technology. And yet the AI doesn't factor into this narrative in the slightest. You're given the choice of either giving the AI back to the Angara, to which the AI itself objects and explicitly becomes uncooperative, or to take it back to the Nexus to be integrated with your own AI so they can talk to each other. Regardless of your choice, the Angaran AI is absolutely useless in terms of uncovering the actual past of the Angaran race. Speaking of choices, there are tons of quests that at the very end offer you to make a choice, and those choices aren't broken down into the typical good versus evil dichotomy of the previous games, so it's worth investing some time in thinking about the ramifications of said choices. Or at least that's the theory, because in practice almost no choice you make has any impact whatsoever. Maybe you get reprimanded or praised by a character in the immediate aftermath of the choice, but there are no actual consequences you have to suffer through. No character will leave your crew and no planet becomes completely inaccessible. There's only one planet where you can even lock yourself out of planting a colony. But only because you're being refused to do so, because the Grogan exiles who left the Nexus prior to your arrival in the Helios cluster over some dumb dispute lay claim to said planet. But even that doesn't change much in the end. Nothing really does. You can entirely ignore the problems of the Angara and the Rokar, their xenophobic subgroup that attacks all aliens including you. You can ignore the exiles altogether as well. There's almost no reason for this narrative to be told as an open world RPG. Your character is called a Pathfinder, but everywhere you go there's already someone else there and you have waypoints and markers everywhere. You're not allowed to freely roam around the Helios cluster and explore yourself. Each step of the way you get access to a handful of solar systems at a time, most of which don't contain any planets you can actually land on. Oh, but you can scan them and mine them for resources, which was so much fun in the previous games. Which leads me nicely into all the ancillary systems the game showers you with. Chapter 5: The Search for More Gameplay. As I've outlined previously, the core engagement of Mass Effect Andromeda seems to be comprised of standard issue chest-wallapaloozas and talking to every single person in the Andromeda initiative to ask them why they chose to leave the Milky Way. That's not much to fill a 70-hour open-world RPG with. Luckily, we have tons of other nonsense we can spend our time on instead, nothing of which ever amounts to much. Gathering resources is a bore because scanning planets means hopping back and forth between different star systems in agonizingly slow transitions. Once you're inside any given star system, you can at least skip the commute from one planet to the next, but I'd have appreciated some sort of menu option where I could disable all this excessive back and forth altogether instead of having to skip it manually every single time. You can also gather resources by driving around the Golden Worlds and calling down a mining probe whenever your scanner detects mineral-rich zones. But to what end do we gather all these resources in the first place? Well, you can craft armor and weapons through the minerals you collect, and you can unlock new armor and weapon blueprints through research points, which you gather by scanning enemies and technology with your wrist-mounted computer. In fact, you do lots of scanning overall, be it enemies and tech, or flora and fauna. You know, all those 10 or so palette-swapped animals you can find on every habitable planet in this cluster. In order to craft a weapon, you first have to unlock its corresponding blueprint. And every available weapon and armor has multiple tiers of blueprints with slight improvements. But you can't just buy the most advanced tier off the bat, no, you have to buy each tier individually. And for some reason I seem to never really have all that many research points available to unlock a lot of these blueprints. Especially since there seem to be so many different variations of pistols, shotguns, sniper rifles and assault rifle, and it's never really made clear why I should even bother upgrading them. Luckily, there are also other avenues where you can acquire these research points and materials. One option is to send strike teams to off-screen missions that take a couple of hours in real time to complete, which nets you a bunch of rewards. Doing side quests also grants you Andromeda viability points in regular intervals, which you can spend on research paths that automatically return you weapon and armor research points, materials, and money at fixed intervals. So the goal here seems to be to make the manual acquisition of research points and minerals happen automatically. You know you have a bad system in your game if one goal is to make it redundant. But not only that, because the entire research and crafting system is rendered pointless by regular old loot drops and loot containers you can find in the game world. Weapons and armor seem to scale alongside your character's level, and I never really felt that I was under-equipped for any given fight. Not that it will matter greatly, because a level 1 version of any given weapon is not dramatically less powerful than a level 5 version of the same weapon, and even weapons the game deems as ultra rare aren't game-breakingly overpowered. Besides, you can upgrade your weapons through a variety of increasingly powerful mods, so the base stats of any given weapon aren't that meaningful either way. And even if your weapons were underpowered, the nature of cover combat means that the only downside to a weaker weapon is that fights take longer. But the biggest reason why dealing with weapon and armor upgrades is an absolute chore is because there's no easy way of comparing anything. Oh sure, you can compare the stats of weapons to your current one, but comparing values to other weapons you haven't currently equipped is impossible. And comparing current weapons includes the modified numbers after applying weapons mods, which if you're reasonable would probably transfer over to the new weapon. So it would make sense to just compare these base stats without the mods, and comparing armor is also impossible. Mostly because it doesn't even seem like armor has any individual characteristics, just percentage multipliers that increase maximum health, shields, XP gathering, firepower, etc. Not to mention that you can only change your equipment or teammates either on your own little chip called the Tempest or at the fast travel points on any given planet. I really don't get this limitation. I can always hit a button to enter my inventory, but I can't change anything while in that inventory. Whenever I pick up a brand spanking new weapon after a fight or from a loot container, I have to wait until I arrive at the fast travel point and then actively remember to check that weapon out. There's no way for me to just equip that weapon, immediately try it out on a bunch of enemies and see if it feels good to play. There are dozens of different weapons for each of the 4 firearm groups, but I constantly stuck to the same ones because I always forgot to change them out at the loadout station. And I didn't have the incentive of doing so in the first place if I can't figure out if the playstyle that particular weapon would offer me would even be suitable for me without going through the process of finding a fast travel point, changing my loadout, heading back out into the field and looking for some enemies. There isn't even so much as a target range where you can simply check out all the weapons until you find one that suits you. All of these systems seem perfunctory and not worth pursuing, but without them there wouldn't be all that much you could engage in. But I feel like BioWare have just missed the most obvious aspects of what they could have incorporated instead of the tired old resource gathering and crafting. Vehicular combat and space combat. Back in the very first game, players got to ride around the place in the Mako, and curiously that vehicle had a gun mounted to it. Sure, it was stupidly overpowered when dealing with the Geth, but why doesn't the Nomad have a gun? Why does it seem like neither the Ket nor the Angara have any mode of transportation outside of shuttles? Why is the Nomad merely a tool for getting around the place but never for dealing with enemies? You finally have some open worlds to explore, let's do it Twisted Metal style. Similarly, this is a universe that basically operates on Star Wars logic. And we see tons of ship combat during the cutscenes. Why can't we manually pilot the Tempest or some smaller fighters and take out the Ket forces in orbit? Why does all the combat have to happen in identical looking locales comprised of the same hallways, doors and clutter that looks the same at hour 7 as it does at hour 70? Speaking of looks... Chapter 6, The Animate and the Inanimate. You knew this was coming, and that's exactly the reason why I waited so long to bring it up. And what can I say? Yes, the animation quality, even after this much time and opportunity to fix, isn't all that great. But can I also be honest here as well? I didn't care about it too much for the most part either. Yeah, the weird way characters' facial features seem to twitch and operate independently from each other is jarring, and something like Korra's walk cycle simply can't be taken seriously. But I also have to say that at some point I just didn't notice it anymore. Of course, it is a step back from what a typical game from 2017 looks like. Heck, compared to something like The Witcher 3, which came out 2 years prior to Mass Effect Andromeda, this game's character animation is so bad it's not even funny. But maybe it's because I tend to play games way after they originally came out that I have an easier time accepting something like this or lower fidelity overall and not make a big deal out of it. Heck, I made a video about survival games way after that trend stopped being relevant, and I only played Prey, Doom and the Dishonored games this very year. And I don't want to make excuses for Mass Effect Andromeda's animation quality, just offer up an explanation for why it doesn't bother me personally all that much. What did bother me much more greatly were a number of bugs and also some bewildering design choices. I already mentioned the limited use you get out of Mako, but for some reason it seems like it was designed to be as annoying as possible without crafting or buying any of the available upgrades. Why on earth do I have to switch driving modes to drive up a hill? Yeah, it makes sense to have that in a real car that allows you to trade off speed for power and stability. But this is a video game, just let me drive around the place in peace without constantly switching driving modes. Same thing with the boosts and hover features, why do I have to upgrade them to make them useful? Why even make them limited at all? Ryder can keep sprinting as far as they want without ever running out of breath, which is good, but my Mars rover can't maintain top speed at all times. Why? It also seems like BioWare simply can't wrap their head around UX design. The menus are all convoluted and cluttered. They seem hell-bent on having this circle in the middle and all the text arranged around that in a circular pattern as well. It's all written in tiny fonts and yet wastes tons of screen real estate by being crammed into the middle. It makes for terrible reading and there's so much fucking flavor text in there for every single item in your inventory. Not to mention that ever-expanding codex that constantly fills up with information dumps. I read through that entire available novel at the start of the game and made a point of never ever reading anything in there again, just to see how important this shit actually was. Apparently not all that important. All that effort of writing text for the codex could have instead gone into the quest log, which barely updates and doesn't actually tell you what your aim in any given quest is. It just gives you a checklist of things to do and corresponding markers on your map. And the map is cumbersome to read as well, because for some reason they decided to make it a 3D map that shows height in the Z direction. Unfortunately, quest markers don't actually get placed at their appropriate height, so you're never sure if you have to drive up a mountain or find a cave underneath it. And I thought we had this shit figured out for decades. If I press M on my keyboard, it opens the map, and if I press it again, it leaves the map, and I'm back in the game. But Mass Effect Andromeda is of an innovative mindset. Oh, I can press M to quickly go to the map or hit I to go to the inventory, but to get back out again, I have to hit escape multiple times. And if you just hit escape to enter the basic menu itself, usually it shows you that awful looking radial menu. But every so often when you have unspent upgrade points, it directly opens the skills menu. Fuck off, BioWare, don't remind me that I have skill points available by changing the functionality of certain keys. That's annoying. Maybe I don't want to deal with your skill points right now. Another bothersome thing is the navigation in the conversation system. Whenever you get to choose an answer, there's a little conversation wheel at the bottom of the screen, and there are multiple ways you can interact with it. You can either move your mouse and click on the answer you want to give, or you can helpfully use numbers to quickly choose them as well. But both of these things require you to move either of your hands from your default position. The numbers especially seem arranged in a way that makes sense if you're using the number pad in your keyboard and not the number row above the letters. But here's the thing, the game also allows you to highlight and move the cursor on that conversation wheel with the letter keys that you usually use for movement. So A goes left, D goes right, etc. You'd think you could select the answer that way and maybe hit the spacebar to confirm that choice, so you could leave your hands where they are without having to move anything at all. The spacebar is already used as a general purpose confirmation button after all. But nope, you have to use the enter key to confirm, thus requiring you to move one of your hands yet again to make an input. The sad thing is that you can actually navigate that horrible radial menu in your inventory just like I described and move back and forth between screens with Q and E. But for some reason, this UX design philosophy doesn't extend to the conversation system, which only takes about half the entire freaking game. The game is also still full of bugs. I've seen tons of characters slide around the place in their idle poses or walking through solid objects or getting stuck in a weird pose where one of their arms sticks through their entire body. There are also some weird invisible blocks on Eons that you can see by using the scanner. And when you use the scanner, their colliders seem to turn on and you can actually walk on them, but once you turn off the scanner they become non-corporeal again. There's also an entire bugged quest that you can't complete because it's one of those that spawns enemies in multiple waves. And if you kill the enemies in those waves too quickly, the game gets so impressed with your performance that it forgets to spawn the final enemy, permanently locking off that quest. And when that happened, the game also corrupted my most recent save file at the time when I tried reloading, so I had to go back to one of my previous manual saves, which I thankfully often create, and lose some progress. And this one has been very much brought to the attention of BioWare, but it simply was never fixed. There was also a door on the Tempest that refused to let me leave until I saved, quit the game and restarted, and one time when I tried to land on Kadara, the landing animation crapped out and showed me a static screen of some clouds and mountains. Also, isn't it weird that none of the planets you can visit exhibit any form of day and night cycle? There's only one celestial body where this weird quirk is actually explained, and that's Eladon. But the kicker is that BioWare couldn't even get this right. They claim that Eladon is tidally locked, much like our moon is tidally locked to Earth. What that means is that we only ever see one side of the moon from Earth. It rotates at the exact same speed around its own axis as it rotates around the Earth. But here's the thing, Eladon isn't tidally locked to its star in a way that would explain the permanent daytime as BioWare wants you to believe. Eladon isn't a planet after all. It's a moon of a gas giant planet that you constantly see in the sky, something like Europa or Io, the moons of Jupiter, which are also tidally locked to Jupiter. So if Eladon is tidally locked to its gas giant, it still means that it travels around the planet, otherwise it wouldn't maintain its position in orbit. And as such, it should have a day and night cycle after all, simply by virtue of it rotating on its own axis in relation to its star, but also whenever it dips behind the gas giant, which would obscure the view to the star itself. The only way a moon could theoretically be tidally locked to its planet and still always point toward the sun with one of its sides is if it were a situation like Uranus, whose axis is perpendicular to its ecliptic plane, meaning that it seems to roll around the sun. Except since Uranus isn't tidally locked to the sun, it and its moons still experience a day and night cycle. But whatever, it's not all that important, just another curious little thing that didn't get the amount of attention it should have gotten and only matters to nerds like me. Another thing I feel hasn't gotten all that much attention is the aesthetic of the game. Granted, each type of area has its distinct visual style to it. Outposts and ships from the Andromeda initiative are all clean and predominantly white with square rooms and rounded doorways in there. The Angara have a bit more of a makeshift design to them that favors more intricate pathways through their structures. This is visible on the planet Aya and on their settlements on the planet Vold. The Kets seem to favor amorphous designs and a utilitarian use of space, which makes sense since they're an invading army. And the Remnant/Jardan stuff is all matte black with lots of harsh angles and geometric designs. That's all well and good for differentiating the locations and tell you where you are. But the downside to this is that everything bleeds together and looks the same. You can enter a vault on any given planet and they all look identical. You can enter a Ket base, one of their palaces, or even the command ship and they all look identical and all have that ugly piss-colored tinge to them. And it doesn't just stop there, because none of the architecture or even the clutter makes visual sense. I was amazed by the many shapes a loot container can take, none of which seem to have a clear and obvious method of ingress. If walking past a container wouldn't make a marker appear that told me that it was interactable, I wouldn't know. Cat consoles just appear to be shapeless blobs, but somehow our character is able to determine what's supposed to be what and even operate it with a little help from our friendly AI. It also means that none of the human settlements you can build have any character to themselves. Sure, the town run by the exiles on Kadara and the Krogan colony on Eladon have their own flavor to them, but your own little outposts all look identical. And what's even worse is that there's never a reason to remain in those settlements once they're established. Sure, there are a few quest givers and shops there, but that's all there is to do, and quests largely don't require you to stay within these settlements. They're more content with sending you halfway across the map to shoot at something. What I'm trying to communicate here is that even though you're ostensibly there to colonize these planets and are regularly told that the progress is going swell in these colonies, the only visible change that happens is that at one single point on the map there's suddenly a huddle of 6 or 7 containers and a few people who hang around there with a shuttle landing or launching at regular intervals. It doesn't feel alive or evolving. What I can say evolves, however, is your relationship with your crewmates. There might not be many reasons to talk to most of the characters in this game, but I really enjoy the interpersonal relationships between Ryder and their crew, at least for all the aliens. I never got warm with Cora for some reason, and I hate Liam with the fiery intensity of 1,000 George Foreman grills. Seriously, this guy is just an asshole. He constantly goes on and on about how much he liked working with his mates at his old job and how he misses home. Dude, why did you even come to Andromeda in the first place? He's also terrible at following orders. This dude is claimed to be a former police officer, and I certainly know why he's a former officer. Because if he was this bad at following protocol and orders from direct superiors, he wouldn't survive a day on the force. He literally initiates quests under false pretenses and threatens the initiative's relations with the Angara for no reason whatsoever. He always goes on and on about having some contacts and organizing something in the background, but he never simply comes forward and actually gets permission for it from his superiors. Not to mention that his shtick of relating all the events of the game back to crisis response, which is what he worked in after getting kicked out from the police force, is really grating. I can't stand people who only have one aspect under which they see things and always try to relate them back to this one aspect of their lives. And his overbearing optimism becomes so freaking annoying too. This entire mission has to succeed in his eyes only because otherwise he'd feel bad about it. Dude, the universe doesn't just revolve around you and your shitty couch. Also, put a fucking shirt on. Right, where was I? Oh yeah, I was talking about how much I like the interpersonal relationships. And I swear I do mostly like the rest of the crew, especially Drac the Krogan, Jal the Angara, and PB the manic pixie dream girl Asari. Yeah, she got on my nerves when I first met her, but she really became endearing by the end. I like her high-octane energy and her sass, and Jal has a quiet sense of hopefulness and open-mindedness and a deeply romantic streak to him that I really enjoy. He reminded me a lot of Thane from the original trilogy, and Drac might seem like a one-dimensional gruff Krogan warrior on the surface, but underneath he really cares both about Ryder and his granddaughter Kesh. He wants to be by her side and do things right, and he really comes across like a great father figure to Ryder, or at least a cool but slightly dodgy uncle that lets you do things your parents would never allow. Especially given the absence of Ryder's real father after he died at the beginning of the game. I didn't spend much time with Vetra, the female Turian, on board, but I like her overall arc where she has to accept that she can't constantly protect her little sister from all the harm that she has to endure, and it's sweet how they advance their relationship by the end. The rest of the crew, the pilots and the engineer, don't get all that much screen time and aren't all that well developed. But really, how could they ever compare favorably to Joker from the original trilogy? You can't top Seth Green, that's just an undeniable fact. The only other character that becomes fairly important later on is your twin sibling and your relationships with your parents. Your twin is absent for most of the game because of plot convenience reasons and only enters proceedings during the finale as a MacGuffin. As such, it's hard to get a definite handle on their personality. It also doesn't help that during my playthrough I tried to create the stupidest looking character the character creation would allow me to as a contrast to my own character, which undermines some of the character drama somewhat. But a lot of character drama is centered upon your parents. Your mother suffers from some incurable disease and your father is desperately trying to find a cure for her, which is why he was so hell-bent on creating an AI to help with that. As you might remember from the original trilogy, AI was outlawed in the Milky Way after the Geth went off the deep end, so it's reasonable that he wouldn't find many supporters, and as such your father eventually became a pariah after his otherwise exemplary military track record. You're led to believe that he failed in finding a cure and your mother dies at some point, but as it turns out she's on the Ark as well, just under a different name so as to not raise any suspicion. The idea was to search for a cure in Andromeda while she stayed in cryostasis to halt the progression of her illness. Unfortunately, this plot thread never gets resolved by the end of the game. In fact, many things don't get resolved. Chapter 7: Endings and New Beginnings. After the game is done, I didn't feel like I accomplished all that many things. Yeah, the Golden World can now sustain life and relations with the Angara are moving along nicely, but there's just so much unresolved stuff to do that it hardly feels like I did everything that we were supposed to achieve. This is because the game is content in dangling a ton of loose plot threads in front of you and never attempts to resolve them, as evidenced by all that business with your mother. But not just that, the game's ending clearly shows the Ket Primus in a way that's supposed to indicate that the fight with their race is going to continue. Heck, a large part of this character's memorability, aside from being maybe one of 5 Ket you ever speak to, comes from the fact that he actively tries to betray his superior, the Archon, because he believes that the Archon shouldn't focus so much on the Remnant tech, and instead follow orders from his high command to exalt everybody. So we know for sure that there's the rest of the Empire lurking out there somewhere in the rest of the galaxy. Remember, even though this game is called Andromeda, we only ever play inside the fictional Helios cluster, which is a small collection of star systems and not the entire galaxy. Then there's that business with that mysterious shape-shifting benefactor who funded this entire operation. It's never made clear who this actually is or what their goal with the Andromeda Initiative was. There's also the murder plot against Initiative founder G.N. Garson that possibly ties into the benefactor's story, but that also never gets resolved. The most egregious cliffhanger comes in the form of a distress signal from the Quarian arc right at the very end, which is supposed to carry along not just the Quarian, but also the other races that weren't important enough to actually show up in this game, like the Drell, the Elcor, the Hanar, the Volus, and maybe some others. It's clearly meant as a setup for some kind of expansion that never got released because the game didn't manage to rake in enough dough to justify making it, and BioWare already had to spend plenty of resources just to attempt to fix the animations. All these unresolved matters should be a lesson to every other game studio that you can't bank on the success of a game and simply leave matters unresolved with some sequel bait at the end of your game. Even if it's a series that many people love. Instead of filling this game with pointless sandbox collectibles and endless identical linear third-person shooting, why not actually tell a complete story in a single game? Not everything needs to be a multi-part series. The designers said that they didn't plan Mass Effect Andromeda as another trilogy, and yeah, that might be true, but they clearly thought they could at least wring out another sequel out of this property, but that'll only happen if the first installment is successful enough to even justify the production of a sequel. Maybe there's something brewing at BioWare that'll eventually address these story threads, but I do hope that they and others learn some humility out of this. Flaunting possible sequels all over the place reeks of arrogance. They thought that this game would sell like hotcakes and easily rake in enough cash to convince EA to greenlight a sequel. Chapter 8 – Conclusion. As I've mentioned at the very beginning, I don't think Mass Effect Andromeda is an outright terrible game. I've also said that I was having trouble with starting this critique based on the fact that there isn't one big reason to either praise or condemn this game and use as a hook. There are a lot of little things in Mass Effect Andromeda that make it a lesser experience than it could have been. That's the reason why I chose to go into so much depth for this game. I can't point to one single element of this game that makes me say that I don't recommend it to others. It's the sum total of all the little bits and pieces that are lacking that keep me from recommending it. The combat is repetitive and boring, the other gameplay aspects are only there to be made redundant, there's no actual semblance of this actually being a real RPG, and the open world nature only adds unnecessary filler and the commute to every side quest. Conversations are merely treated as ways to spout exposition or move the plot along, and the whole romancing business seems like it's just an obligation at this point because fans have come to expect something like this. The narrative and world building don't attempt to deviate too far from what we've already seen in previous games, and the lack of any resolution to the story means that there's very little closure to be found. And the bugs and the lacking animation are the icing on this cake that prove that very little care and attention went into the making of Mass Effect Andromeda. Honestly, after the rocky launch where people mostly focused on the animation problems, I thought I could maybe look past that and maybe there's a decently playable and enjoyable game underneath, since people are prone to memifying every new release to some extent, but rarely focus on the really important bits. Unfortunately, the many shortcomings that I've discussed here do ultimately mean that Mass Effect Andromeda did disappoint me. I'd still be willing to play an eventual sequel to this if for nothing else than to finally get some closure for some of these story threads, but I can't in good conscience recommend this game to others who haven't played it yet. Not when you could use the same amount of time and play through the entire original trilogy and have a better time with it. Thank you very much for watching. This has been quite a long critique for Mass Effect Andromeda. I usually try to be more concise with my thoughts on games I review, mostly because I don't like wasting people's time with needless fluff to reach an optimal target length for the algorithm, which is why my reviews vary wildly in length and scope. I try to stay focused on the important bits and not dissect too many details that don't matter when viewed in the bigger picture. But also because editing these long videos and combing through dozens of hours of gameplay footage to find examples to go along with the script can be a pain in the ass. But I felt that this game deserves a proper examination because I do believe that there isn't one singular thing you can point towards and say why it was so underwhelming. So again, thank you very much for enduring my ramblings about Mass Effect Andromeda. Let me also try something new for this time. I've always hated it when others do it in their videos, but apparently it does work in gaining a larger reach on YouTube. So if you've liked my thoughts on this review, please share and push that like button and maybe subscribe to see what else might be coming in the future. And if you disagree and think that I've forgotten to talk about something, do leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. Well, until next time, bye bye.